The footage ended on a single frame that made Elias's hands go numb. A hulking silhouette caught in the silver smear of night, eyes like slow moons, a head tilted as if listening to the exact same thing he had been listening to for 50 years. His voice trembling, whispering a name that no one else had ever heard him say aloud. For half a century, Elias Hart had carried the forest inside a cardboard box. Spools of grainy 16 mil, battered tapes labeled in a careful slanted hand, notebooks that smelled of resin and rain. And when finally, one night of perfect light had given him a creature that watched him without fear, he had believed the whole house of his life could be set right with that image. By dawn, the world had swallowed the evidence. The video he uploaded at 2 in the morning vanished by 8. The hard drive he mailed to the National Archives, wrapped in an envelope smelling faintly of juniper, was gone. Someone, somewhere, had leaned across a bureaucracy and erased 50 years of proof in the space between coffee and morning. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Elias sat at his kitchen table with his hands folded over the box of film, as if it were a fragile animal that might wake if he breathed too loud. His kitchen window framed the old firs like a black comb against the pale sky. The forest he had mapped for decades breathed in and out beyond the glass and continued to be an enemy and a prayer. He had been awake all night, editing frames on an old projector that hummed like something alive. He had sent copies to the media, to a university, to a museum he trusted more in principle than in practice. He had mailed a hard drive to the National Archives at the Capitol, a place where men in suits like to sit with their thumbs hooked into the fashion of authority. The drive had left his hands in a bubble of hope. Now the hope lay hollow as a blown glass bead in his chest. When the news websites that had flashed his name and the images a whisper before dawn scrubbed the files clean and replaced links with buffered logos and official-sounding denials, Elias felt an indignation sharper than grief. Someone had not only removed his footage, they had removed his voice. His wife's name, the one he murmured in the footage, Marta, hung in the air, a talisman that refused to break even as facts were folded away. For 50 years, those trees had held his wife like a secret. For a night, he had thought the secret would answer, and the world had closed its fist. Claire Novak arrived before noon, breathless, urban shoes leaving small wet tracks on Elias's porch. She was younger by decades, the kind of woman who could carry a camera and a coffee cup like weapons and read the truth in a bureaucrat's half-smile. She had a reporter's face, curiosity carved in the set of her jaw, and the small, stubborn respect of someone who had grown up on the edge of a forest and never quite left it behind. She pushed the storm door and looked at the box of film with the reverence of a person who understood both its material and mythic weight. "You're him," she said, not as a question. Her voice held the edge of accusation and the warmth of kinship both. "You're Elias Hart. I watched the clip last night. Somebody reposted it before it disappeared. God, sir, that frame." "It disappeared," Elias said. He felt older than the porch steps he had climbed alone, older than Marta's laughter, which sometimes echoed in the dull corners of his house. By morning, it was gone. The archives called me back, said the package never arrived. My email deleted. The university said they had never received anything. Someone took it. Claire's eyes narrowed in a way that told him she knew the world could act like a living thing that swallowed what it wanted. "Do you have copies?" "I have spools, tapes, originals." Elias tapped the box. "But the files I uploaded were meant to be distributed. I wanted people to see clearly. I wanted someone to look at that frame and not call me mad." Claire shrugged off her jacket and sat at the table opposite him, the chair making a small protest against the wooden floor. "You did the right thing," she said. You put it where it couldn't be ignored. There was a flicker of something else, hunger. But someone with money or power didn't want it seen. That's not proof they're right. It's proof they're scared. Elias watched the set of her mouth, the honest abrasion of youth against his memory-tired features. He had been alone for so long, he had almost forgotten the texture of being argued with. "What do you want, Ms. Novak?" Claire smiled, and it was immediate, a flash of teeth like a promise. "Claire, I want the whole story. Not just the footage, although that frame will burn people, but the life behind it. Your notes, the paths you walked, the night your wife disappeared. I can find the backups, Elias. There are corners of the internet and people who keep what institutions throw away. You're a journalist." Elias's voice was a small thing. "Journalists, they use people. You think I will?" Her eyes hardened in a way that was almost childlike in its fear. She was used to being dismissed as young and hungry. "I grew up on the edge of those trees. My father—" She stopped herself, closed her mouth on a memory that had been shaped like a story told by a hearth. "My father told me about footsteps that were too big for a man, about fires dimmed as if a hand had been passed through a room. He's sick now. I need—" She swallowed. The rest of the sentence was a throb in the room. "And if they were, Elias, someone is erasing them." Silence spread between them like a map that had yet to be unfolded. Elias found himself shaving time from the past to make room for Claire's present. He told her, haltingly, about Marta, how she had been like light in places where light didn't belong, the way she had loved the forest with an almost childish affection, collecting mosses, humming the old names of trees from languages both local and older. He told her how the night Marta went out, there had been a scent in the air like copper and rain, and when morning came, she had not returned. "You never found her?" Claire asked, though she knew the answer. The question was, like most of theirs now, folded into the spaces of a much larger problem. "No." Elias's hand rubbed the line of his jaw as if trying to smooth the memory. Tracks sometimes. Broken branches that could have been her. A single mitten down by the river a year later. But no body, no finality. The forest keeps its own time. He laughed then, but it was not light. "So I kept watching. If there was some creature there, if there was a witness, I would not be the only one to have a story." Claire pored over his notebooks. Her fingers found the names he had given creatures in languages she recognized from childhood stories. Omul Paduri, Pushchin, and she felt the hair on her arms stand up. Here was myth written in ink, methodical notes of sightings, weather, the way the animals behaved, how deer would veer from a path as if avoiding something else, how coyotes went silent. She saw sketches, Marta's handwriting in lighter script when she had accompanied Elias years ago, and the ache in Elias's throat when he spoke of her softened the edges of the mystery. What the footage had promised was not only vindication of belief, but a reaffirmation of a marriage stretched across wilderness and time. Merritt arrived like a place that had always been waiting at the edge of a map, tall, with the kind of shoulders that knew the weight of a pack, and a face that had been both softened and hardened by sun and wind. She wore the uniform of a forest ranger in a manner that made it look less like costume and more like a skin. Her family name, Merritt said, meant keeper in an old tongue. When she spoke of the law, she sounded like someone who had learned it as a bargaining language rather than a weapon. "You shouldn't have sent it public." Her voice was low, threaded with a warning that seemed older than her years. "Do you know what happens when people make the forest legible? They come with machines. They uproot what they can't understand. They take. We don't keep this place by letting everyone in. We don't prove it by keeping it secret," Elias countered. His knuckles whispered against the wood. "We've kept it secret for 50 years, and they call us lunatics. They have erased what I finally found." Merritt's eyes flicked to Claire, noting her notepad, her phone, the way a reporter's hands betrayed readiness. "And you, Mrs. Novak, what will you do when men with guns show up to study what you publish? Will you stand between them and the trees? My family earned access another way. We made agreements. Our grandparents taught us to hide certain things." She softened, and something like old tenderness flared. "We did not do it to hoard truth. We did it to keep it safe." Claire folded her hands in front of her, the journalist's posture becoming tentative in the face of a local's claim to guardianship. "We can protect the forest while we bring the truth out," she said. "We can make people outraged enough to stop logging operations, to make politicians answer. Or we can expose the cover-up, if there is one, and make the society that erases think twice." The three of them looked at one another like people trying to negotiate a raft between reefs. Elias felt, with a pain like gratitude, that the years had not been wasted. They had led him to a point where his box could be opened by hands that cared. But he also felt the old terror, that exposure would not only lay bare his life, but would invite forces that had already proven adept at erasing him. He thought of Marta's mitten in the mud, of the way the river took shadows and made them its own. He thought of the frame where the creature watched him without fear, and wondered whether the creature watched all of them now through the trees, patient and enormous. "Someone took what I sent," Elias said finally, the words slow and even. "They took it because they could. That means they'll take more if we let them. That means we have to move carefully." He looked from Claire to Merritt, as if reading a map on their faces. "If we are to find the rest of the story, we will need each other. But we will also need to be honest about what we might lose by asking for it to be known." Claire's hand hovered over her notebook, the pen like a sword. Merritt's jaw set in a line carved from a lineage of quiet defenses. Outside, the firs leaned together as though they were listening. The three of them made a private covenant that felt much like a beginning. To find what had been taken, to decide whether truth would be a weapon or a protection, and to learn, in the process, how to hold one another when the world chose one side to believe and chose another to ignore. They made plans with the fumbling courage of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The house filled with maps, with Elias's careful ink rings, with Claire's printouts of cached web pages, and the names of archivists who answered with ellipses rather than help. Merritt paced between the windows and the box of spools, thinking in routes and watchwords. Which back roads held cell service? Which logging companies ran trucks at night? Which ranger stations would answer a request for backup, and which would send a badge and a demand? They argued until the late light moved like a hand across the table, carving the room into slices of urgency. "You can't just run to the city and print 1,000,000 copies," Merritt said, stopping at the doorway with a breath that fogged the glass. "The more we amplify this, the more people like the contractors you mentioned, Claire, will sniff blood. They've skinned plots before. They'll call it folklore and then buy the land legally. They'll call us troublemakers and bring in men who do not care what they destroy." Claire had the seed of impatience that belonged to anyone who had spent years seeing systems bend toward secrecy. If we bury it, nothing changes. People in the capital get to decide which histories remain alive. That's why we get the story out, make it undeniable. Her voice rose despite herself, and Elias heard the thread of righteousness he'd seen in activists and in young lovers, a belief that publicity is a sword. Elias folded his hands until the knuckles shone white. "Denial isn't ignorance, Claire. It's a tool. Taking the footage didn't just hide the thing itself, it signaled that someone with reach chose to rewrite the story. If we respond with a staged spectacle, whoever erased it will stage a counter-spectacle. They will win where they are strongest, in the corridors of power. We have to be cleverer than their confidence. Merritt looked at him, surprised. You want secrecy from a man who filmed a creature for 50 years? I want prudence, he said, for Marta's sake, for the forest. His eyes slid to the window where the firs were smudges against the sky. If there are beings that watch us and decide, as our elders said, who may pass through the gates, we must not invite the world's hunger on the same map as their home. It is easier to call you a liar when no one can see your proof, Claire shot back, softer. You've been a myth for half a century, Elias. That makes you both adorable and disposable. If we don't show them even a sliver, people will keep smiling at you and moving on. She closed her mouth and then opened it again, softer. And there's a personal part to this I won't pretend isn't there. My father's coughing has gotten worse. The clinics in town are stretched thin. Land values are rising because there are whispers of new extraction rights. If the forest's value goes to industry, my father comes last. The stories that kept people away are the only real protection the ridge has had. If they're erased, my home will be sold. Marit's expression crumpled like paper that has been folded for years. I cannot let another Marit leave. My family keeps certain roads closed, blogs you won't find, and cameras you will never see. We will not let a company like Forsen come in. They have the politicians in their pockets. The name hung like a smell. Forsen, a multinational with a neat logo and a history of buying old-growth easements, of promising jobs while stripping soil. People like them operated in boardrooms and in bulldozers, wearing the veneer of progress. That they might unmake not just trees, but the very idea of witness, set a fine edge against every plan. Their first move was to retrieve what they could of Elias's original material. The spools were irreplaceable, weighty with time and light and the small human imperfections, stutters in the film, footprints of insects in the emulsion. Marit offered a contact, an old woman who lived in the next valley who kept an analog transfer rig, a slow machine that translated celluloid into digital without giving it up to the teeth of a server. The woman's hands had been hands of keepers before her. She baptized images with caution. They left before dawn. Elias wrapped the box in a blanket like a small coffin and drove with his hands on the wheel as if steering could reorder memory. Claire rode shotgun with a recorder that hummed like a small animal, asking questions gently as if she were coaxing a bird from a nest. Merritt drove like someone who had been trained to read the land by its scars, taking a back road that weaved through stands of cedars and old clearings now seamed with moss. On the ridge, the air tasted of green things and rain. The transfer woman, Anka, had a lean face and eyes that measured people quickly. She took the reels, laid them on her table with reverence, and told them while she worked that she had seen men come to her floor with televisions and promises, wanting images of ghost things packaged for prime time. She always refused. There was a way to share and a way to sell. The difference was whether you honored the image beyond the transaction. You put this on a server and it will belong to whoever pays the most for the bandwidth, she said, spinning a reel with a motion that looked like an old prayer. You keep it here and it belongs to the people who remember how to hold something without showing it off. There are archives who will aid you, and there are men who will pay to make your memory inconvenient. Elias watched Anka work with the childlike awe of someone watching a page of scripture carefully unfolded. He told her about the night he'd filmed the creature, the way the light had been wrong for a second, the way the tree line had opened like a mouth. He told her his belief that the creatures were not mere beasts, but custodians in some ancient pact, and he told her, quietly, that he had once thought they had taken Marta to keep her safe. Anka hummed without judgment. "The forest keeps how it keeps," she said finally. "If it takes, it gives." But this image, if it is what you say, will set a new balance. People will want proof the way they want banknotes. They will either bow or they will bulldoze. I will make copies, but before I touch the light, you must tell me what you will protect." Elias heard Claire inhale sharply and tasted the old edge of being a man who had worn faith like armor. "Everything," he said, and the word arrived small and surprised in his mouth. He felt the weight of that promise like a stone on his chest. Not just the image, but the forest, the creatures, the myths, Marta's memory. He would guard it even from himself, if guarding meant keeping the forest alive. They left with 2 hard drives, one hidden in Elias's boot, and one with Claire in a locked case. The drives were not identical. Anka had made analog-to-digital transfers with a slow fidelity that held film grain like a secret. They had also loaded a bootleg copy to an encrypted node Claire swore she could lay eyes on in the city. It felt like smuggling saints. Back in town, a different danger waited. Claire sought allies who knew how to make a story stick, people who understood how to build momentum without letting it be co-opted. Her editor, Jonah Reyes, was an old-school investigative journalist with a taste for danger and a dislike for the powerful. He listened to her in his office, filled with awkward light and the smell of coffee that had gone cold from too much use. He liked the roar of a political scandal and the precise tang of corruption. The footage interested him in the way a match likes dry wood. "You're sure about the provenance?" Jonah asked, flicking through Elias's notes that Claire had smuggled into his hands. "If we run something shaky, Forsen will bury us legally. If it's clean, though, this could rip open a lot of stuff." "It's clean," Claire lied with a small, honest tremor in her voice. "And if not clean, we make it clean. The archive said they didn't receive a package. That's a story in itself." She told him about the overnight erasure, about men who could make a server's memory go blank before breakfast. Jonah's eyes lit up with the hunger of a man who smelled a door ajar. He offered a plan to publish a seed, an article about the disappearance of the footage and the improbable man who'd gathered the forest in a box, accompanied by an anonymized clip if security access could be ensured. "We don't reveal the whole thing," Jonah said. "We catalyze curiosity, push the government to answer why they can vanish evidence. Let them tie their hands to a narrative. They'll be forced to speak." Claire's excitement warred with Elias's caution and Marit's line about agreements. She left with a copy of Jonah's outline and a promise to balance exposure and care. On the drive back to Elias's, she watched the firs and felt the tiny ache of betrayal like a bruise under skin. She wanted the story to save the ridge, and she wanted her father to have a reason to stop worrying about mortgages and air that tasted like industry. She also knew what Jonah had not said aloud: a good scandal invites predators. That night, Elias slept in short breaths, hands finding Marta's sweater folded like a talisman. He dreamed of the creature's eyes, slow moons that seemed to see through the age of men and the smallness of institutions. In the dream, it spoke not with voice, but with the turning of a great, patient head. He woke with the memory of its tilt and the certainty that he had to protect whatever living thing had been given away to men who did not understand how to be careful. The next morning, Claire called with news that tightened the room around them like a fist. Jonah had lined up a legal advisor willing to press an inquiry about the disappearance of Elias's package from the National Archives. It would not be a public hearing at first, but a probe. He had also found an old server farm in the capital rumored to host government mirroring, a place where backups were sometimes archived in secret at the request of certain agencies. "If the footage was taken," Jonah said over the crackle of distant rain on the phone, "it's likely been mirrored somewhere else." Elias felt both hope and dread. The idea that the footage might still exist in some steel room gave him something to chase, yes, but it also meant someone had access who could make it vanish again. He pictured a phantom bureaucracy with shelves where things vanished into bureaucratic dust. and a hand of men who thought themselves caretakers when they were, perhaps, just thieves with titles. Moritz suggested they test the edges of the problem without exposing what mattered most. "We can probe without shouting," she said. "We can ask questions that make the agencies uncomfortable but not legally compromisable, so they speak. If they lie, we'll have evidence. If they are honest, then maybe there are people inside who can help." The plan felt like a rope thrown across a dark river, fragile but the only way to cross. Claire would open small doors in the press. Elias would provide authenticated material under seal to a trusted archivist Jonah recommended, and Marit would watch the roads. They would move carefully, each step measured, all of them aware that curiosity and love, Claire's hunger for truth, Elias's devotion to a lost wife, Marit's guardianship of a landscape, pulled like tides in different directions. It was precarious, and in its precariousness, it felt like hope. Still, beneath the strategy slept a darker animal, fear that publicizing the truth would not only draw interest, but violence. That fear sat in Elias like an old scar that would flare when the light hit it wrong. He had thought all his life that vindication would be balm. Instead, he had been warned that vindication might be a torch. He thought of Marta's mitten in the mud, and of the creature's patient, moony eyes, and he could not tell whether bringing that image to light would give the forest a voice or a target. The three of them knew the truth of being insufficient alone. They had, between them, a reporter who could make noise, an old man who had lived his life as a witness, and a ranger who could read the language of the wood. Their campaign would be a lattice built of different kinds of truth. And when they set their plan in motion, subtle queries to agencies, the transfer of a sealed copy to Jonah's custody, Merritt's eyes on the trails, they each felt the old weight of history settling like dust over their shoulders. The past always touched the present, and sometimes touching it bruised the fingers. In town, shadows lengthened as if the forest itself leaned closer. Men in suits could already be assembling, in meeting rooms with placid coffee, arguments that would justify erasure becoming legal grammar. In the ridge, families kept their lights low as if to remind the trees that people still watched. Claire's recorder thinned with notes. Elias folded his hands and practiced not to speak Marta's name aloud, as though saying it too often could cause the world to forget it entirely. Merritt checked the locks on gates she had inherited and thought of roads she would keep closed as long as she could. They had crossed an invisible line, and beyond it lay questions that would not bend to polite inquiry. They were making a project of the impossible, to defend a thing many called myth by the tools of a world that traded in certainties. Each of them bore a piece of vulnerability: Elias's grief, Claire's dependence on the truth as a kind of justice, Merritt's duty to a lineage of hidden guardians, and each fear fed the other's resolve. By evening, the first small prod reached a bureaucracy. An email, carefully phrased, asked for confirmation of receipt, a call that sounded routine. Records showed no package. Server logs had no anomalous uploads, and the National Archives suggested perhaps an administrative error. Elias read the reply with a hand that trembled, and though his heart wanted rage, his head remembered Anka's slow fingers and the need for safeguards. They had learned how the world could tidy a story away. They now set to learn how to pull at the threads without causing the whole tapestry to fall. Each move they made would measure desire against danger, hunger against protection. As the rain on the roof grew insistent, Elias watched the forest outside his window and felt the steady, impossible impression that whatever watched from the trees had noticed their movement and was assessing how to answer. The first fracture came like an echo you could not ignore. A photograph printed in a morning paper, grainy and cropped, credited to unknown. It showed Elias's porch from an angle he did not recognize. His open storm door, the box of reels half glimpsed through the frame, and beneath it, a caption asking whether a local eccentric had staged a hoax. Claire found the clipping shoved under her windshield wiper at the convenience store, its smear of ink like a small public verdict. "What did you expect?" Jonah said when she brought it to him, folding the page with professional calm. "They'll discredit the messenger first." He tapped the photo with a blunt index finger. "We don't publish the image yet. We tease. We ask questions. We demand answers. We give them the rope to hang their denial." Elias saw denial transform quickly into accusation. Radio hosts with cheap gravitas called him a charlatan. A local pastor declared the footage demonic and argued for prayerful removal of temptations. Someone anonymous had posted on a community forum that Marta had left Elias years before, that the whole story was a fantasy meant to extract sympathy. The post gathered cruel replies. Elias, who had expected to feel vindicated or at least relieved by the world's attention, instead found himself boxed by gossip and old-town cruelties that stayed the same even as technology accelerated. "People want easy stories," Merritt said that evening, turning a mug between her hands until it warmed. "They will choose one where no one is inconvenienced. A man who is lonely and a myth that comforts them. Neat. It's simpler than admitting a state apparatus might have reasons to hide something." Claire fought to keep control of the narrative. She drafted a piece about the missing package and the vanishing upload, an article designed to force institutions to answer without releasing the footage itself. Jonah arranged for a lawyer to send a formal inquiry. He also pressed for a sealed viewing of the transferred files. He wanted to see the footage himself before they released anything public. The plan should have felt straightforward. Instead, every step forward revealed a new seam where distrust lay waiting. When Jonah accessed the encrypted drive at the paper under supervision, an internal glitch corrupted the first minutes of footage. The segment that remained, flickers of tree, a shadow, was all the trolls needed. Someone on social media looped the corruption into an accusation of forgery. Elias had spliced grain from an old camping reel and sold a myth to the press. Jonah swore the corruption was a file translation error. Claire swore it had been manipulated. "They have ways to do this on purpose," Merritt said, as if speaking to herself. "To make you believe that your own things are lying." Elias began to suspect someone had not merely erased his public upload, but had learned how to seed doubt. It was almost surgical. Selective absence, then a leak of damaged evidence to make the whole enterprise seem incompetent. He pictured men in neat offices inventing the atmosphere of an old man's failure, the staged photograph of his porch, the forum post, the corrupted file. The forest outside his windows felt suddenly vulnerable in a new way. Beyond bulldozers and chainsaws, there were people who could make reality unreliable. Tensions tightened between Claire and Marit. Once allies, they argued over strategy until their voices were raw. Marit accused Claire of naivete. Claire accused Marit of secrecy that bordered on cowardice. Elias listened between their barbs, the old fatigue of years unspooling into something like anger. "You don't understand how a leak can kill a place," Marit said, pacing the kitchen. "They want a reason to put in roads and machines. They need a pretext, scientific curiosity, public demand. You give them a pretext, Claire, and my family will be looking at bulldozers at dawn." "You act as if secrecy is always better," Claire shot back. Her face was flushed with the double heat of fear and righteousness. "What about truth? What about justice? You think the men who can erase footage will stop at a photograph? They will bury evidence and reputations. If we don't make noise, they win through silence." "It's not either or," Elias said. He felt like a child trying to keep two larger people from ripping a thing in half. "We can leak carefully. We can make the inquiry public without showing the frame. We can push for accountability, but we cannot incite a feeding frenzy on the forest." Marit's laugh was sharp and brittle. "You think this is about the forest only? Do you think the men with bulldozers care about a tree? They care about profit, but profit needs cover, stories that make plunder seem like progress. You will be a story under that cover." Claire's jaw thinned. "And if we do nothing, profit will take the forest anyway. The cover will be a zoning law." "You're hiding a thing you fear to lose, rather than singing its existence loud enough to rally people." Their arguments revealed fissures not only of tactic, but of belief. Marit's secrecy was rooted in generational guardianship. She had been taught to make offerings, to close certain trails, to keep elders' bargains. Claire's hunger for exposure was driven by a need for justice and by the modern conviction that sunlight heals corruption. Elias's faith in both secrecy and revelation was twisted by grief. He had lived in an in-between where proof mattered, but not at the cost of what it proved. Between the fights, smaller betrayals accumulated like rain. Someone anonymously phoned Anka and asked pointed questions about Elias's visits. Anka became nervous, her hands trembling while she rewound film. A man approached Marit at the ranger station, pretending to be from a conservation NGO, and asked for records of her family's easements. He smiled too wide. Those two incidents, mundane on their own, stitched together into a pattern that made Marit restless and sharp. "Who do you trust?" Claire asked Elias late one night when Marit had gone to check a gate. The kitchen light was small, and the shadows of trees pressed against the glass like palms. Elias thought of Marta. He thought of the small towns with their gossip and grudges, of archivists with ellipses, of men with suits who could say nothing and still erase a thing. He felt suddenly, bitterly, how small trust could be. Only a person, a knot of people. "I trust the box," he said, and felt the absurdity of it. "I trust Anka's hands, and I trust Marit's map, and I trust you not to sell the story for a byline. Maybe that's not much." Claire's face softened in the ambient light. "It's enough," she said. "We'll make it enough." But her voice held a thinness like paper. The leaks escalated. A local contractor announced a partnership with a developer to survey timber rights near the ridge. The press release was dry and legalistic, its language designed like a net. An op-ed in the state paper questioned why rural communities clung to superstition instead of embracing industry. The candidates for a county seat began to speak about development and jobs. Each move was small, each scripted to normalize extraction and to frame locals as resistant to progress. Elias felt his prognosis narrow into a series of choices he had no right to make alone. If he released the footage himself, live, uncensored, he might stop the bureaucrats' easy erasures by making a spectacle that could not be quietly scrubbed. But spectacle could become a hunt. Men with profit in their eyes would not hesitate. He imagined Marta's mitten again and wondered whether her absence was an act of protection or a wound the forest inflicted to teach a lesson. One night, Marit admitted something she had kept like a wound. They were seated on the porch, the box of spools between them, June air thick with the smell of pine. "My grandmother told me a story once," she said, voice low enough to be private. "She said our family did not only close roads, we traded. We took a vow to reroute what we couldn't protect into rights no money could buy. Once, a logger came with a gun and a smile. My grandfather met him with a bowl of river water and asked for the man's name. The man laughed and left because names frighten some things." Marit's hand brushed a reel as if it were sacred. "I have kept some names in my pocket because I believed names hold power." Elias felt the room align. This, then, was the fracture line. Not only institutions that erase evidence, but a culture where knowledge itself could be a commodity or a covenant. Marit had sworn to keep a covenant that might require secrecy even at the cost of being called backward. Claire had sworn to reveal what was hidden, even if the revelation toppled elder bargains. Elias, who had lived in the gap between, had to choose whether to honor a promise he made to a woman who had never returned, or to honor a promise to a town whose economies were brittle and hungry. The emotional break did not come with shouting, but with a quiet that felt like a crack widening. Claire began to push for publication. Jonah's pressure increased. Marit tightened patrols and closed gates without telling everyone. Elias shuffled between them, his heart pulled by apology and by a stubborn belief that some things had to be protected from the hunger for proof. Each act of secrecy felt like betrayal. Each act of exposure felt like violence. Then came the concrete fracture. Marit received a call from her uncle, a man who kept one of the older routes open for woodcutters in emergencies. He reported that a Forson-appointed surveyor had been seen near a southern ridge, near a trail Marit's family had kept unmapped. The surveyor's truck had been reported with a government contractor's plate. The message was clear. Someone had begun to map the unmapped. Marit's face went hard. "They know where to look," she said. "Either we were sloppy or someone told them." She looked at Claire with a new suspicion she could not hide. "Who have you shown the files to?" Claire's reply was immediate and raw. "Only Jonah, Elias, and a lawyer. Her voice broke. "I wanted to protect this place by making it visible. That visibility required allies." "You made it visible to someone who leaks," Marit said, each word a stone. "You think leaks will protect us? You think publicity will hold back bulldozers?" Their accusations were small, precise weapons. Elias felt them cut. He realized the fragile web of trust they had spun was already catching thorns. That instant, he recognized an older pattern, that when people fear loss, they will seize control, even if control means cutting each other out. Claire's eyes flashed with wounded anger. "You accuse me because you think I'm young. I am trying to save a community. I have ties here you do not understand. My father's life could change if the forest is protected. I took care." "You took care by selling the possible to a man who wants headlines," Marit answered. "You used your father's fear as a banner." Elias put his palms flat on the box. The reels hummed in the wood like sleeping things, and he felt a fierce, protective tenderness for them, for Marta's handwriting on a margin, for the way Anka had kissed a strip of film before she sent a copy. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, the wind carrying the green smell of the ridge, and said what his two companions needed to hear, though they might not want it. "We are not the same," he said. "We will fail if we act like we are. Claire, you see the world as something to fix with light. Marit, you see history as a shield. Both are true, but we cannot keep breaking at each other if we are to survive what's coming." The words did not stitch the wound. They only made the shape of it clearer. Claire's hands trembled. Marit's jaw tightened. Elias felt exhausted in a new register, grief from a lifetime, and now grief for the unraveling of a special coalition that had felt like family. He realized, with a cold knowledge, that secrets and fractures were not only external. They lived inside them, in dashed expectations, and in the way love and duty could cleave people apart. They went to bed that night with the box between them like a fragile treaty. The forest outside breathed and kept its own counsel. Inside, the town's gossip slashed like a newspaper. Outside, men with interest in chips and contracts began to slide into place. The real work of Act 3, when things that had been hidden came to light and tore at the seams, had only just begun, and none of them slept well enough to face what would come next. They left before dawn like contraband, Elias carrying the heft of the spools in a pack that smelled of juniper and old paper. Merritt driving with the quiet competence of someone who had been taught to move like weather. Claire in the back seat with a locked case and a recorder that vibrated against her ribs like a small animal. The ridge was a throat of green and mist. Birds fled like punctuation as they passed. The plan, such as it was, hinged on one desperate thing: making the world see in real time what a bureaucracy could not erase in a single morning. Anka had finished the transfers and hidden a master in an old bank vault 2 valleys over, under a name she would never speak aloud again. She loaded the second copy on a drive Claire could access from the city through encrypted channels. But one thing no machine could deliver without risk was the nuance in the frame, the tilt of the creature's head, the way it did not flee a man who had come to watch the forest for 50 years, the tenderness in the image that spoke more of guardianship than of threat. If that image reached millions at once, it could force a narrative that institutions would struggle to fold away. Live, Jonah had said. Go live. They can't scrub the night from the feed if it's out with witnesses. Make it unignorable. Elias did not want spectacle. He feared feeding the very hunger he had watched for half a century. But his grief had taught him a harder truth. Sometimes protection required risk. Marta had been made part of the forest when she disappeared. For 50 years, he had been keeping her as memory. If unveiling the creature could stop the bulldozers that whispered in Forsen's press releases, then risk felt like duty. They would go with deliberate witness. Merritt arranged for 3 rangers she trusted to mount perimeter watches. Jonah gathered 2 independent livestream technicians under non-disclosure. Claire and Elias would be the public faces, but Merritt drew a line. No guns, no baiting, no calls to anger. They moved like a litany of cautions because their enemy was not only men with equipment, but men with appetites that diplomacy could not tame. They hiked a path Elias knew as precisely as the lines on his palm. Night closed like a hand. The forest was full of breathing things. Every twig underfoot sounded like a tiny accusation. Elias's instincts thinned into a single thread of watching. After hours, they came to a small clearing Elias had not visited in years, where the river made a clean, honest sound, and roots knuckled like old hands out of the earth. He set the projector up on the tripod with the ceremonial slowness of someone who had never quite learned how to be gentle enough. Claire's live feed went out with a shiver of static and then settled like a held breath. The chat filled with skeptical laughter, and with prayers, with trolls, and with people calling their friends' names. Jonah's team kept the signal routed through anonymous mirrors so that no single server could be compelled to delete what they would show. It felt like juggling embers. They did not show the whole reel. They began with the archive. Elias reading a passage from his notebooks about Marta, the names she loved for the trees, the smell of the river when it ran low in August. He spoke in a voice weighted through years. His hands shook, but not in fear. only in the tender arithmetic of memory. Then they showed fragments. Deer veering off a well-worn path. A series of enormous footprints with a tread pattern no boot could match. Night footage of trees lit from within in a way that made bark look like skin. The world was hungry for spectacle. They gave it context. And then Elias started the single frame that had been taken from the upload overnight, the creature's silhouette and silver night, its head tilted, eyes like moons. The chat went wild. For a moment, the ugly edges of the internet sharpened, people who wanted to exploit, people who wanted to deny. But a new thing happened too. Thousands wrote with the ache of recognition. Messages arrived from farmers, from elders, from little towns across the country with stories that matched his. A viral momentum gathered like a storm. The live feed was a hammer and a net. It slammed into speculation and caught testimony. The legal inquiries Jonah had seeded with his contacts began to ripple. An aide in the Capitol forwarded the stream to a committee who could no longer pretend ignorance. Forson issued a terse denial and promised review. For the first time since Dawn erased his efforts, Elias felt the world tilting toward him. But spectacle draws predators. Halfway through the broadcast, a convoy of unmarked trucks rattled on the old logging road like an answer. Merritt's watchers radioed in breathless warnings. Men with bright helmets and GPS devices were approaching the perimeter under the pretense of survey operations. They were polite on the radio, but the intent in their engines was visible in the way their headlights lanced the trees. Elias looked at Merritt. She was fierce as a winter wind. He looked at Claire, whose face had grown thin with the strain of exposure and with the sudden realization that their act of revelation had a cost beyond pixels. He felt the familiar ache blossom, the knowledge that he would have to choose. The footage was doing what he had wanted, forcing accountability, but it had also signaled a hunt. "Take the reel," he said quietly. "Take the master. Hide it where no machine will find it." Merritt hesitated. The watchers were already moving to block the ingress points. Claire's hands hovered over the transmitter, the audience still growing. The men in the trucks would not be moved by legal niceties. They would clear a path if persuasion failed. "You can't run with it forever," Claire whispered. "If we lose the feed—" "We are not running from them," Elias said. He rose, the sound of his bones like old timber. "We are giving them a choice." He stepped out into the soft light and toward the road. A handful of cedar branches clenched in his fist. He did not carry a weapon. He carried a witness. Marit cried out, a sound half command, half plea. But Elias walked on. He had known for years that words mattered. He had also known that some truths required bodily witness. If men would be shown a stubborn, unarmed old man standing in their road, perhaps their moral armor would take an awkward, visible form. Perhaps shame, which is a blunt human instrument, would do what law could not. Elias stopped under the truck lights. Men in safety vests emerged like shadows with faces. Their leader, a man with closed eyes and a name badge that read "Forson Survey," smiled a corporate smile. "You can't be here," he said. "This is active survey land." "My name is Elias Hart," Elias replied. His voice carried down the road. The live feed caught it. Thousands listened. "I have kept the forest because it kept my wife. I have proof. We showed a part of it to the world tonight." There was a beat where the man's polite smile wavered. Men are never sure how to meet grief in the street. It is inconvenient. The cameras recorded the moment, and with it, the optics shifted. Some helmets hung awkwardly. Phones were lifted not for orders, but to record. "You're in the way," the leader said, softening into procedure. "We have legal permits." "Then take your permits to the committee asking questions tomorrow," Elias said. "Leave the machines. Let men speak in rooms, not in the trees." He felt his heart hammering like a fist. "I am asking you, as a neighbor." It was absurd to think a request could sway engines. For a long moment, no one moved. Then something effervesced in the darkness. Phone flashes, the spontaneous recording of a man refusing to be moved, the knowledge that the world was watching them choose between authority and a small, dignified defiance. A man with a clipboard stepped forward and, after 2 minutes that felt like hours, handed the leader a photocopied mandate from a county office. The leader scanned it and, with the visible relief of bureaucracy served, nodded. The trucks edged back. They did not leave. They retreated like a tide pulling momentarily away. The live feed exploded with commentary. They pulled back. He stood. Old man versus industry. But what mattered was quieter. The world had watched Elias stand in the road and choose protection over spectacle. It was a kind of sacrificial negotiating. He had offered his body as witness so the forest need not be incised by machines that night. When the convoy left, Marit rushed to him, hands on his shoulders as if to make sure the old thing was still real. Claire wept into the stuffing of her jacket, not because the broadcast had gone viral, but because a human being had offered himself in place of a myth. Elias felt the fatigue like a river draining from his limbs and a fierce, surprising lift in his chest. "You could have been trampled," Marit scolded. "You would have called me foolish," he said. And there was laughter in his voice, thin as ribbon. It was the sound of surrendering certainty and gaining something like mercy. "Perhaps I am, but I would rather be foolish and keep these trees one night longer than be right and lose them forever." The rest of the night was a scramble of communication, lawyers to committees, rangers to watchmen, activists to volunteers. Jonah's inquiry would be taken up more fully the next day, prodded by the footage and by 1,000 witnesses who had seen an old man stand between civilization and appetite. Forsen issued a cautious press release promising cooperation, the language of companies when the market is watching. But the real change came in smaller messages, private ones that arrived like balm. People who had once scoffed at Elias sent notes recalling a summer they had seen a thing move beyond the tree line. A scientist who had once dismissed the whole matter asked to see an unredacted transfer under seal. Claire's father called and said simply, "You did right," the words thin with relief. Marit's uncle called in the night and reported that 2 of Forsen's trucks had not returned to the ridge. They had been stopped, questioned, and rerouted by an officer who had watched the live stream and called for instruction. Elias understood, dimly and finally, that the moral truth of the footage might not be a legal proof, but a human one. He had hoped for vindication like a court's verdict. Instead, he was given something more precarious, a network of people who would now testify that they had seen. It was not the absolute he had wanted, but it was a living thing. Stories clustered like seeds. He looked at Claire and Marit, at the bruised, tired faces of his comrades, and felt the warmth of a new claim laid down. They had won a small, brittle victory that night by sacrificing the safety of secrecy for the dangerous currency of witness. It would not end the campaign or settle every ledger. People with power still had arms and paperwork. But for the first time in 50 years, Elias felt less alone in his conviction. Under the trees, where moss softened the earth like a benediction, Elias pulled from his pocket a small mitten, Marta's, and held it like a relic. He kissed the worn wool, and then, with absurd reverence, set it at the base of a sapling. It felt like offering more than memory, a pact that if the world would listen, they would protect more than rumor and print. If not, then he would keep his vigil. Claire filmed the small sacred gesture and did not broadcast it. Some things, she had learned that night, needed to be guarded with a tenderness that was not meant for the public square. She tucked the footage away with Anka's transfers and Marit's maps and Jonah's legal packages. The live feed had done its work. It had opened a small breach in the erasure. Elias had given a sacrifice that was not a life but a readiness to be seen, to trade his solitude for the chance that others might stand with the forest. They walked back to the car under a sky that was clearing. The lights of the town were dim, imperfect as a memory, but they felt, for now, held. The trees hummed like something listening. Elias thought he could feel a presence at the edge of the clearing, patient as ever. He did not know whether the creatures would approve or resent the night's exposure. He only knew he had done what he could. He had chosen a risky truth over a safe silence, and in doing so, had invited others to bear witness. That night, the news anchors could not simply scrub what had been seen. The narrative would splinter, and the fight would continue. But Elias slept with a small peace that belonged to people who had risked love in order to protect what they loved. He woke with the ache of a man who had given a sacrifice and found that the world, indifferently, had begun to tilt in answer. They woke with a quiet that felt like recalibration. Town noises returned but softer, as if the ridge had taught the valley to be more careful with its clatter. Jonah's legal probe widened slowly into a committee review. Forson's press releases grew defensive and then diplomatic. The servers that had once swallowed Elias's upload now held mirrored fragments in safe hands. The master reels rested in Anka's vault beneath a name she refused to speak. It wasn't a clean verdict. It was the messy, human thing, witness multiplied into community. Claire published a story that balanced outrage with tenderness. She named the erasure, traced the bureaucratic threads, and framed Elias not as an oddity, but as a man who had kept a marriage alive in the language of maps and film. The piece did not unleash bulldozers. Instead, it opened conversations. Town hall rooms filled with people who had memories they had never voiced, scientists who asked for sealed viewings, and a slow, stubborn national curiosity that meant the capital could no longer pretend nothing had happened. Merritt's patrols grew more organized. Neighbors learned which gates to close and which calls to answer. Her family stopped a survey crew the next month by turning up at a municipal hearing with organized testimony and a lawyer who knew the weight of public witness. Elias found himself less lonely because people began to bring him small things. A loaf of bread, a Smith-made mitten like Marta's, a note from a woman who remembered being led home by a shadow that had not seemed human. Some nights he sat with Claire and Merritt and watched footage they had kept private, frames that smelled like juniper and river and the soft silver of moving light. And he felt, at last, less like a man guarding a ghost and more like a keeper of a shared memory. They did not achieve a tidy victory. Forson still had lawyers. Politicians still smiled through interviews. The creatures were not cataloged in any scientific ledger, but the public had been asked to choose, and many chose to believe in something other than tidy profit. The live feed had not proven everything, but it created a mosaic of testimony that changed how people spoke about the ridge. It made bulldozers harder to justify, and conversation harder to silence. One evening in late autumn, Elias walked the edge of the clearing alone. The world had learned to listen in other ways now, through petitions, through sealed transfers, through the slow diplomacy of a community refusing to be erased. He knelt and traced a finger around the mitten he had placed at the sapling and felt the bark's warmth. The forest breathed. Maybe, he thought, it had always been a congregation rather than a secret. In the dim, a figure shifted between trunks, not a threat, but attention, an answering silhouette that tilted its head in the same patient motion as the frame that had begun everything. Elias closed his eyes and, for the first time in 50 years, let himself believe that witnessing could be enough. He stood, the mitten warm in his palm, and walked back toward the light of the town, not to claim a final truth, but to tend the fragile, living proof that love and memory could hold a place from being taken.